Hello, I'm Mel Atke. I'm the author of Broadway North and A Million Miles from Broadway, and I am a lecturer on all things musical theater. The first French composer since Offenbach to enjoy worldwide success with a book musical was Marguerite Menot, who is perhaps best known as Edith Piaf's favorite songwriter. She trained with Nadia Boulanger, who also trained the Broadway composers Charles Strauss and Mark Blitzstein, as well as orchestrator Robert Russell Bennett, French film composer Michel Legrand, and the Argentine tango composer Astor Piazzolla, all of whom in some way contributed to the musical theater. Poor health had forced young Marguerite to give up a career as a concert pianist, and she turned instead to popular music. After many hits, including La Vie en Rose, Hymne à l'amour, Milord, and La Galante de Pauvre Jean, she first turned to writing for the theater with La Petite Lily, an operetta with book and lyrics by Marcel Achard, starring Piaf, Robert Lamoureux, and Eddie Constantine, which lasted for 7 months in 1951 at the ABC Music Hall in Paris. Then, on November 12, 1956, came her biggest success, when Irma la Douce opened at the Théâtre Grammont. The book and lyrics were by Alexandre Brefort. He expanded a short story he had written for the satirical magazine Le Canard Enchaîné, the Chained Duck, of which he had been editor since 1934, which he had already turned into a 20-minute cabaret sketch in 1949 at the Cabaret Chez Gilles for the company Grenier-Huguenot, Le Harangue Terrible. Harangue is an argot slang term for a man who lives off the avails of prostitution. When he and Menot expanded it into a full-length entertainment, he was emphatic that it should be a comédie musicale and not an operetta.
L'histoire qu'on va vous raconter, c'est une histoire extraordinaire.
Y a rien à se dire, y a qu'à s'aimer, y a plus qu'à se taire qu'à la fermer, parce qu'au fond les phrases, ça fait tort à l'extase.
Tous ces hommes, c'est affreux.
Bah, mon amour, c'est le métier. Ah, dis donc, c'est toi qui me fais du dingue. Ah non, c'est pas du pour, je suis bien mordu pour ta jolie gueule d'amour, ma gueule à moi.
Bob Lehotu introduces the action. The story we are about to tell you is the story of a ménage à deux, something you don't see every day. The story concerns a naive member of the Paris underworld, a law student in the English version, named Nestor Lefrippe, Rumpled Nestor, who falls in love with a prostitute and becomes her protector. Wanting her to himself, he disguises himself as a wealthy patron named Oscar, who buys her exclusive services. When the strain of maintaining this double life becomes too much for him, he kills Oscar and is convicted of murder. Only through bribery is he able to convince the authorities that he didn't actually murder himself. The original production was directed by René Dupuy, director of the Théâtre Grammont from 1954 to 1973, who also played the narrator Bob Lehotu, proprietor of the Bars de Iniquité, bar for worried people. For the leading role of the prostitute Irma, the part finally went to Colette Renard, who was married to the show's musical director Raymond Legrand.
Ah, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, ce que tu me plais, j'en suis dingue. Ah, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, c'est toi qui me fais du gringue. Ah non, c'est pas du pour, je suis bien mordu pour ta jolie gueule d'amour, ma gueule à moi. Ah, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, je sais pas ce qui m'arrive là. Ah, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, dis donc, tous les jours c'est gala. C'est pas du boniment, du bidon, car je sens battre mon palpitant quand je te vois.
Another sometime Piaf collaborator, Legrand's son Michel, was the uncredited co-arranger for a four-piece onstage band. Nestor was played by Michel Roux, who had also appeared in the original sketch. Le Figaro said, Alexandre Brefort achieved a sleight of hand in dealing with a difficult subject without for 1 second falling into the trap of vulgarity. It transferred to the larger Théâtre de l'Athénée and ultimately played for a total of 962 performances, including a 1967 return engagement. Irma la Douce managed to achieve what few of even the best French musicals could manage. It was successfully adapted into English. Bandleader Henry Hall had seen the show in Paris and obtained the rights, which he then sublet to Donald Albury for Donmar Productions and Binky Beaumont for H.M. Tennant Limited. Monty Norman, David Henniker, and Julian Moore had already collaborated on the music business satire Espresso Bongo. On the strength of this, they were approached by the producers to provide an English libretto for this French hit. The director was to be Peter Brook, whose only previous musical was 1954's short-lived House of Flowers, with a libretto by Truman Capote and score by Harold Arlen. It is fair to say that the English version of Irma la Douce is an adaptation rather than a translation. The challenge was enormous, for all the elements that had defeated shows like Fifi were there in spades: a risque subject, a distinctly French flavor, and liberal use of slang terms such as grisby, or money, poule, prostitute, mec, pimp, and milieu, Paris underworld, and expressions like dis donc, you don't say. Not to mention Brefort's penchant for puns. Imagine trying to translate the Damon Runyon dialects of Guys and Dolls, and you'll get the idea. Even in Paris, a glossary was provided in the program. After several versions had been thrown in the wastepaper basket, wrote Julian Moore, the principal author of the book, we eventually hit on the right way to present Irma to English audiences. To avoid use of Bronx or Cockney slang equivalents, so beloved of subtitlers and so killing to Gallic atmosphere. This has been a common practice. A quarter of a century later, the French working classes in Les Miserables spoke with a Cockney, and in the Dutch version of My Fair Lady, Eliza Doolittle speaks with a Jordaanese dialect from the working class de Jordan area of Amsterdam. Instead, they chose to use a few French argot terms and to adapt the lyrics freely, taking Brefort's thought line but creating our own shapes, and in some cases, writing completely new lyrics to Minogue's music. For example, they cut the original opening number Because and created a new number, Valse Milieu, using the same melody as the title song, in which Bob Le Hotu introduces the slang terms we are about to hear. In some instances, melodies and the characters who sang them were entirely reassigned and the musical structure adjusted. Because Elizabeth Seal was a dancer, choreography by Canadian-born John Hewood was added, which was largely absent in the original. The collaborators resisted advice to sanitize the story and dialogue, and to add more female characters, Irma being the only woman among 14 men. Director Peter Brook maintained, The English version was a faithful translation of the original French production. Give or take a few score terms in Montmartre argot, we did take liberties there. The story, characters, and author's attitude are unalterably French. Our friends advised us to change the locale to London or New York, but we felt the local flavor of the milieu, that is, the community of prostitutes, procureurs, and thieves of the back streets around Pigalle, must be maintained. Of course, in those days, all scripts had to be submitted to the Lord Chamberlain's office, the censor. He, to everyone's surprise, passes our script intact, writes Brooke in his published memoir. He only cuts without explanation one word, kiki, and I haven't the heart to tell him that this, in Paris slang, simply means the neck. The casting of 25-year-old Elizabeth Seal also had to meet with the approval of Marguerite Monod. Seal spoke no French, and Monod no English. Seal remembers, "I stood on the Globe stage and sang what became the language of love." David Henniker played piano. The Moore-Norman-Henniker team hadn't even had final approval at that point to adapt and rework Irma from the French. Marguerite sat in front stalls, and when I finished the song, she got up and kissed me on both cheeks. She didn't want a singer as such. She wanted something more raw from the streets. I did have to work on this. However, she liked my cracks. I then had to wait 7 months whilst the boys, they were called, translated, changed, adapted Irma for the English audiences. So that I could turn down other work, Binky paid me a retainer. I don't think that would happen nowadays. In Paris, it was and is, of its own strange kind, a masterpiece, wrote Harold Hobson in the Sunday Times. One did not notice there the absence of offense. One was conscious instead of the actual presence of virtue, of a love that is, of all quiet things, of generosity and response to kindness. In London, the cast bar their minds against all thoughts of evil, whilst in Paris, the company, with glowing innocence, seem unaware that evil could possibly exist. Following tryouts at the Pavilion Theatre, Bournemouth, where it opened 24th of June, and at Theatre Royal Brighton, Irma la Douce opened at London's Lyric Theatre on the 17th of July, 1958, where it ran for a record-breaking 1,512 performances, starring Elizabeth Seal and Australian actor Keith Michell. The prompt book of the London production reveals that 2 songs were rewritten during the run. Valse Milieu replaced the lines,
Milieu's the name of the underworld mob. Pool is the girl who goes out on the job. Mech is the fellow who pockets the cash. Grisby's the cash, which is lovely to stash.
with
This is the Paris that hides from the day, waiting till night for the stranger to stray. This is a world you forget or forgive, sinner or saint, we have all got to live.
The lyrics for Wreck of a Mech were also entirely replaced. Before opening in New York under the aegis of David Merrick, the show went through yet another transformation. Très Très Snob, which in the original version had been C'est Polit le Mu, or It's Spineless Polit, was rewritten as Sons of France. A very Broadway-sounding overture was added, as were 2 major dances arranged by future composer John Kander and choreographed by another Canadian, Anna White. Irma la Douce opened at the Plymouth Theatre following a 2-week tryout in Washington, D.C. on September 29, 1960, with the same director and the same 3 stars, but with additional orchestrations by Robert Ginsler, who had done the same chores on Gypsy and Bye Bye Birdie, and ran for 524 performances. Peter Brook's future assistant, Nina Perry, remembers, "I saw Irma la Douce in London many times when I was very young, and I was passionate about the show and the music. The original production had great rough charm and the feeling of a tiny part of Paris. But when I listened to a record of the New York version, it had a very different feeling. And what a surprise when what must have been a very long new dance routine, somebody suddenly shouted, 'Penguins!' during the number. There is only one Paris for that. There were no penguins in London. It felt more like a Broadway idea of Paris. How could it not? The music was reorchestrated by great Broadway musicians. That was obviously how things were done in those days." Noted New York theater critic Howard Kissel has said, "What made Irma a show of note, though no one sensed it at the time, was that despite its saucy and daring score and its horror with a heart of gold plot, it was very much an experimental musical. It used almost no scenery. Its cast consisted of all men except for the title character. At a time when American musicals prided themselves on their psychological subtlety, Irma relied on old-fashioned touches from vaudeville and burlesque to tell its story." Following Irma's worldwide success, Minogue was invited to write songs for Walt Disney. Interesting in light of Irma's subject matter. But she didn't want to leave France. In 1960, she and Brefort wrote one more musical together, L'Impasse de la Fidélité, which starred the music hall chanteuse Patachou, or Henriette Regon, at the Théâtre des Ambassadeurs. The following year, she died of a ruptured appendix at the age of 58. The film rights to Irma were sold to the Mirich Corporation 2 months before the Broadway production had even opened, but they had to wait until the stage show had run its course before they could begin shooting. Director Billy Wilder then hired Shirley MacLaine, who had recently starred in the film of Cole Porter's Can-Can, to play the title role, and Herschel Bernardi, who would later star in Fiddler on the Roof, was cast as Inspector Lefebvre. The supporting cast included Bruce Yarnell, who had starred in the Lincoln Center revival of Annie Get Your Gun opposite Ethel Merman, and Canadian character actor Lou Jacoby, who had appeared in the London production of Guys and Dolls, and Pal Joey as Moustache, or Bob Lahotu in the stage version. Even Jack Lemmon as Nestor had been known to put across a song, and the presence of Andre Previn as musical arranger certainly pointed towards the show being a musical. Yet, as Wilder and his co-screenwriter I.A.L. Diamond progressed with their adaptation, they gradually reached the conclusion that the songs had to go. "I've nothing against music," he says, "but the more I went into the story, the better I thought it was. And for me, the numbers got in the way. So first one of them went, then another went. Then one day I made the decision, and we threw the whole score out and made it a straight picture." Producer Walter Mirisch says, "He felt more comfortable doing it as a straight farce. He had done only one musical, The Emperor's Waltz, with Bing Crosby, and it had been unsuccessful." Thus, Marguerite Minogue's music was relegated to the background, although Dis donc is virtually staged as a diegetic musical number, even though no lyrics are sung except for a brief exclamation at the title. Minogue and Brefort were both credited as the original authors of the play, without any specific reference to music. Andre Previn won an Academy Award for his adaptation of her themes, including Language of Love avec les Anges and Dis donc. Interestingly, in her later one-woman show, MacLaine performed some of the songs that she would have sung in the role had she been given the chance.
Behind the gate, the thug streets are cold and hard, the shutters locked and barred. Irma, what is alone?
While the film was, at the time, the most commercially successful of all Wilder's, it is not one of his best remembered. Many feel that by cutting out the songs, he cut out the heart. It's hard to know how Brefoort and Monod felt about the English version. After Brefort's death in 1971, Colette Reynard said, "You never knew if he was happy or unhappy. He loved to make people laugh, but personally, I never saw him laugh." There was, for a time, an embargo placed on the English language version because of a possibly financial dispute with the estates of the French writers. Brefoort himself never understood Irma's international appeal. "There are feelings that do not make it across borders," he said. "My heroine is so typically Parisian that you couldn't even transplant her from Belleville to Ménilmontant. Of course, as soon as you move anything outside of its native language, you separate it from its culture. But I believe that what distinguishes Irma la Douce from Fifi and other French musicals that failed in translation is the extent to which Messrs. Brooke, Norman, Moore, and Henniker respected their source material. The fact that they attempted to preserve as much French atmosphere as the English language could accommodate surely counts for something. Irma la Douce was revived in concert at New York City Center Encores in 2014.